I'd like to now turn the conference over to our host, Patrick Gilligan. Please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, COPA members, non-members, UAV operators, and enthusiasts, and welcome to this AIG Magnus Group webinar on UAVs. My name is Patrick Gilligan, Vice President of Operations at COPA National in Ottawa. Currently, I'm part of Transport Canada's main working group on UAV regulation processes, representing personal aviation concerns. In recent years, COPA has been extensively involved on several industry government working groups to develop regulations that would enable permit UAVs to access unrestricted airspace. This has been proven to be a time-consuming task, and we're still years away from enacting these extensive regulations. In the meantime, use of UAVs for work-related activities continue to accelerate, and there is an increasing number of small aircraft being purchased for recreational use, whose operators have no idea what limits apply. So now I'll try to move it forward. Here we go. So, slide 2. Work will continue to develop. COPA will work to continue to develop regulations with the regulators, and that will eventually permit most UAVs to operate in unrestricted airspace, including yet to be developed sense and avoid technology. A long-standing insistence of COPA, and COPA will remain engaged in the working groups developing these regulations. So in here, this slide, we're presenting the KRAC, the process we're using at Transport Canada, these working groups. And in here, the working group provides suggestions for drafting proposed amendments, suggestions for new regulations, and there are 4 phases that are being processed. Phase 1 is a visual line of sight for non-recreational, less than 25 kilograms, and the final report was completed first week of April. If you want more information on current Transport Canada requirements for UAVs, I would suggest going to this link here, or by doing a quick and simple Google search using the words such as Transport Canada UAVs, and this will bring you to this link, and you could look at the current regulations. I put this slide in here because it gives you a person, this flow chart gives a person, and it's a must for recreational, non-recreational UAV operators. It drills down to determine if you need an authorization or if you can operate under the exemption or no permission is required. But in this case, the UAV operator is still responsible for any kind of endangerment to aircraft flying close to airports, etc. And these actions are criminal offenses, and charges can be laid by appropriate authorities. Next slide has good bullet points, and these 2 slides are available on Transport Canada's website. And these bullet points are the requirements for UAV operations under the exemption. All recreational UAV operators, this is only the recreational operators, are strongly recommended to join the Model Aircraft Association of Canada, or MAAC, which is easy to find on the website. So this is my contribution to this webinar, and with that, I'll now hand it over to Carson Lyon from AIG Aerospace to provide more detailed operations. Off to you.
Mr. Lyons, your line may be muted.
No, I was just waiting for the screen to change. Sorry about that. Good afternoon or morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today to provide a little bit more information on unmanned aircraft. For those of you On the call, many of you may be somewhat familiar, very familiar, or not very familiar at all with the regulations, the use of the aircraft. So what I hope to do is provide a pretty general overview, and regardless of where you may be on the knowledge of UAV spectrum, provide some maybe new food for thought to consider or use going forward as you are thinking about these in your flying activities, whether they be with manned or unmanned systems. When COPA and Magnus and AIG sort of got together and discussed this, the first thing worth noting was that the title of this was supposed to be these were now on the horizon, UAVs now on the horizon. The first thing is we have to change the title. They're actually here today. There's some reports indicating there are not only hundreds or thousands, not just tens of thousands, but possibly hundreds of thousands already operating both recreationally and commercially in North America. And it won't be too long before we see that number go into the millions. So they are very active around the world. What I'm going to try to do here is provide a pretty comprehensive overview of the history, some of the regulations, what the rules are in Canada right now on a very general standpoint for the use of unmanned systems, some of the uses for the aircraft as well, what the approval options are for commercial operators, the need for some education and awareness, and some underwriting considerations. That's obviously what we're focused on here at AIG Aerospace. Some of those, the underwriting, what we're doing to review the unmanned aircraft that we are seeing and being asked to consider for insurance coverages, and then some final conclusions before we address some questions at the end. Just want to give a personal introduction to give a little background on myself. Again, my name is Carson Lyons. I'm a vice president with AIG Aerospace in Atlanta, Georgia. Graduate of Embry-Riddle in Daytona Beach, Florida. Private pilot, longtime member of AOPA here in the U.S. And I've been involved exclusively in aviation, hull and liability underwriting for a little over 15 years now, primarily on the turbine, fixed and rotor wing general aviation business. So it's a little bit about my background. A short history, how did we lead to this webinar that we're talking about right now? I think some of the first things we need to consider is human beings have been putting things into the air without people on board for centuries at this point, but where we really kind of get into the unmanned stuff started around World War I, where we really started seeing some technology developments and initiative on that standpoint very early in the 19-teens and early 20s. It was 1924, however, that the first RC aircraft flight actually took place, and obviously that is an incredibly important piece of history and time, talking about unmanned aircraft and remote control aircraft going forward. A bit of sort of history or coincidental information. Really, World War II and the lead up to World War II saw the British really develop an unmanned remote control target aircraft called the Queen Bee. And if anybody is obviously familiar with what a mail bee is called, a drone, not so coincidentally, that's how that term may have kind of proliferated into common vernacular here today. Also, kind of interestingly, back in 1939, there was the formation of the Radio Plane Company, which was actually part of the Northrop Grumman corporate history. So this stuff's been around for quite some time. World War II saw the development and use of some unmanned systems as well that involved manned aircraft taking off and the pilots jumping out and having the airplane continue as basically a flying bomb until it ran out of fuel. A lot of different things there, but it was really through Vietnam, through the 70s and the first Gulf War in the early 90s, where we saw the birth of the General Atomics MQ-1 Predator, which is probably the most famous unmanned aircraft at this point, just because of its involvement with the world conflicts and some of the positive and negative connotations that maybe go along with the sight of that aircraft, depending on the perspective of an individual. Really, once we got into the 2000s, though, and into the later years, the last few years, the technology, not just from the RC side, that has been incredibly important in the development of the unmanned systems we're using today, but also from the standpoint that the technology itself, the cameras, the GPS equipment, all of that stuff became lighter, became cheaper, became more reasonable and feasible for the general public to get a hold of. And it was really, 4, 5, 6 years ago that businesses really started looking at this in a much more rapid manner than they had been before. hey, we can start using this for a real tool. And it's not that expensive, it's cost effective, and that's really led us to where we are today. So what is an unmanned aircraft system? We do hear that term, we do see that term used globally, recognizing that the more common term in Canada is UAV. But first, I think we need to just kind of clear up some acronyms. And for those of you involved with aviation, we know we love them. We use them for almost everything. But really, when we hear the term drone or the word drone, it can mean potentially several different things, depending on where you live in the world. Different countries refer to them in different manners. But all of the acronyms there on the screen kind of mean the same thing from an aviation insurance industry perspective and from a pilot perspective. They're all really talking about the aircraft that doesn't have anyone on board. So why do we call it an unmanned aircraft system when we're looking at it that way? It's that the aircraft itself, the actual flying aircraft, is not the only thing that's a critical component of this. Just like with manned aircraft, there are other pieces of the equation that make a safe operation that allow that aircraft to safely fly from point A to point B through the airspace. So first, the system includes the aircraft itself, just like a manned airplane, the payload, and that's really from a UAV standpoint why that aircraft even exists. If it weren't for the payload, even as simple as just a camera, there'd really be no reason for it to operate from a commercial perspective. The mission support equipment, some of these aircraft have fairly substantial transportation needs depending on the size and complexity. The people, the pilot, the operators, the visual observers, payload operators, the mechanics that may be involved, that's all part of it. The data link obviously is critically important from the standpoint of the aircraft must be controlled by the ground since no one's on board. So that as well is a part of the system that has technological challenges and benefits and issues as well. The space that we all deal with, the airspace, the weather, the regulations that are applicable to any given flight, and the command and control systems, which may be internal. The picture sort of in the middle bottom of that screen is much more similar to what would be flown by an air force around the world for a larger system, where it really does kind of look like kind of a cockpit setup. Two guys sitting beside each other, a joystick, a throttle, those kind of controls, and basically a heads-up display, glass cockpit kind of setup. Versus an external, which is much more common on the small UAV side, which could consist of a hand controller, a laptop, some camera equipment, and the like. So what are some of the commercial and public applications? Where can we expect to see UAS or UAVs used? Where are they being used? The first thing we need to understand here is what the primary drivers are of the development and the explosion of this industry over the last few years. It really kind of comes down to the 3 or 4 Ds. Many of you may have heard these already, and depending on who you talk to, you'll hear 3 or 4. But when we think of manned aircraft operations, there are a number of dull type operations where an aircraft may be simply orbiting a particular location for a wide variety of purposes. Dirty and dangerous areas where it's a challenging operating environment, hard on the pilot, difficult on the aircraft, and may be dangerous from a hostile exposure standpoint. Duration sometimes gets left out of the equation, but when you look at unmanned aircraft, some of these systems are capable of operating for not just hours or days, but even weeks in some case from a developmental standpoint. And the aircraft in those cases don't have the limitations. They don't need to take a break. They don't need rest. They just need to have a sustainable fuel source, maybe come back and land it occasionally. So it's a big difference from a duration standpoint in terms of the aircraft capabilities in some cases. But really one of the biggest ones from a commercial aspect is economic, and it doesn't start with D, and that's why I have it in red there, from the standpoint of these aircraft are, generally speaking, significantly less expensive to operate per hour than a manned aircraft, and in some cases can do much of the same things, and in maybe a few cases even do them better than a manned aircraft can. So companies are seeing this and looking at the advantages of operating a manned aircraft that may be hundreds or thousands of dollars an hour to operate, and thinking, hey, can we do that or accomplish that with an unmanned system that may cost a fraction of that to use? So that's definitely something that needs to be kept in mind when we hear about the development and the explosion of the use of these things. So how are they being used? Right now, public safety and law enforcement, definitely an application here. Many police departments around the world are getting involved with the use of these things. A lot of concern from a public standpoint that the police are looking to do a lot of public surveillance and spy on people and things like that. The reality of it is that they're really being used for image collecting and crime scene investigations after an event takes place because of the camera capabilities and the ability for these systems to get into hard-to-reach areas. They're very useful for that. Other things they can do would be search and rescue, thermal imaging equipment, much the same that would be on a fixed-wing or rotor-wing aircraft operated by a manned crew, finding the little boy that walks off into the woods. Certainly an opportunity for police departments to have a faster response time down the road as more and more of these aircraft are made available and capable of being used for that purpose. And then from a tactical advantage standpoint, being able to launch something in a hostage situation or where there's a fear of a violent criminal of some kind that may be a danger to people at the scene or the police officers that may be responding to an incident. Having that eye in the sky can certainly be a life-saving tool for the officers or the people on the ground. In fact, it doesn't have to do specifically with an unmanned aircraft, but I did hear and meet with a sheriff in Oregon out in the western U.S. That told a story about how their SWAT team actually had somebody surrender to a robot, which was an unmanned ground vehicle, basically a little vehicle on treads that had a microphone and a camera. So they were able to see exactly what the bad guy was doing and tell him to surrender from the robot. And he put his hands up and walked out of the house with no police officers having to break down the door. And the SWAT team was both impressed and kind of disappointed, I think, at the same time, because they didn't get to storm the gate, so to say. But unmanned aircraft will certainly be able to be used in a very similar fashion, I think, going forward. And something very recently that happened with the RCMP is that post the recent Air Canada accident at Halifax with the A320, they actually did use a small UAV to overfly the accident scene and do some surveying and data mapping and photography of the scenario. So I do think there's a kind of an interesting crossover potentially as the systems develop and as regulations develop to have that, even safety benefit from unmanned systems going forward to investigators and rescue workers, using the example of perhaps the Germanwings accident or incident from not too long ago, where you have a difficult to access area, dangerous ground, sharp metal, different things like that would allow an unmanned aircraft to survey the scene maybe first or quickly ahead of ground rescuers, so to not put any of them in danger unnecessarily. Public UAS applications with research and testing. A lot of universities are getting involved with these, seeing a lot of benefits to how they can be used, and some of them are for quite crazy and strange applications. I heard a story of one operator being very excited to be able to fly their small UAV through the spray that comes out of a whale's blowhole and to analyze the microorganisms that live in there. A very strange use, but obviously some benefit to that university and that researcher, and who was very excited to say they would have never been able to do that with a helicopter because it was too big, too loud, and it would have scared the animals away. So a wide variety of uses. One of the most common ones we're already seeing is for inspection of power lines and bridge inspections. Construction businesses and energy companies already using these to a high degree around the world. We do see a lot of capability and application here. And again, the UAV community sees this as an opportunity to reduce costs and save lives, as obviously there have been accidents involving manned aircraft doing similar type jobs that have cost individuals' lives, and looking at UAVs as a potential way to mitigate some of those risks for some applications. Film and television industry. I was watching a television show off our DVR last night that had a small UAV in it. kind of the star of the show for a few minutes. But separately, they're using them for actual filming applications. Many of you who may be James Bond fans, the last James Bond movie that had the kind of motorcycle chase scene across the roofs of buildings, much of that was actually filmed by a UAV. There are a lot of other applications, and I kind of have these pictures of the skiers up there. If you can kind of tell in the middle of that middle picture, you have a helicopter sort of down in that valley where it's a dangerous or at least more challenging operating environment for the helicopter pilot. But in the future, some of those scenes to shoot the skiers coming down the mountain would even be able to be more safely and less expensively shot with a sophisticated small unmanned aircraft without jeopardizing potentially a multi-million-dollar helicopter and the crew on board in the event of shifting winds and weather that may be impacting the flight. So a lot of opportunities there as well. Where AIG and several other insurance companies and disaster relief organizations are looking at these are for disaster response and insurance. The ability to look at mass areas or areas where there's significant ground damage after a natural disaster such as a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake around the world. Certainly the aircraft from an unmanned standpoint could be launched to begin search and recovery efforts to assist ground people in those respects, and from an insurance perspective, be able to overfly larger areas more quickly to potentially handle and address claims in a more expeditious manner than having adjusters trying to get around via ground vehicles or on foot. Other applications, a lot of mapping, communication, a lot in the oil and gas industry. I mentioned the inspections. Security, I mentioned construction already before. Aerial photography, probably the biggest use of the aircraft in terms of the average small UAS operator, small UAV operator at this point. But really it's one of those things where if you really think about it, there aren't too many industries that couldn't benefit in some way from the use of small UAVs going forward. It's really just up to the imagination of the business owners, the companies themselves, to think, hey, how might we be able to use these? So I think we'll see them extend to a lot of industries and businesses and types of operations that nobody's really even thought of just yet. The biggest use of these things, thought to be globally anyway, is for the use of UAVs in the agricultural industry. And really because there's agricultural operations and industry all over the world, and the fact that a lot of farmland is in rural locations away from populated areas really is looked at as a, hey, if something does go wrong, that's a good place for it to be. So there's a lot of opportunity in the ag industry and the capabilities of the aircraft to be able to fly up and down rows of farmland and really do a much more precise aerial survey or overview of the fields provides a lot of potential opportunities to improve crops, to target irrigation and pesticides and those kind of sprays, monitor the livestock, a lot of different things, just with thermal imaging and different types of equipment that may be on board the aircraft to help out the farming industry on a global basis. I just throw this picture up for those of you that may not be too familiar in terms of what these things may look like or the size and the capabilities. This is a fairly typical octocopter, empty as it is without the battery and the camera on board. This particular model weighs about 7 pounds. I apologize for my metric system not working as well in my mind, being the American I am. But with the battery, with the camera equipment, that bumps up to about a 15-pound aircraft, and you can see in relation to the two gentlemen there in the picture, kind of get an idea how large that aircraft might be and with the size and the weight of it. So what's the status in Canada today? First thing I think we need to do is understand the difference between a model aircraft and a UAV. According to Transport Canada, a model aircraft is an aircraft that doesn't exceed 35 kilograms, is mechanically driven or launched, is used for recreational purposes only and is not designed to carry persons or other living creatures. An unmanned UAV is essentially any power-driven aircraft designed to fly without a human operator on board. It's one thing to talk about the size, but more frequently the purpose of its use actually dictates what guidelines or regulations are in play for that given operator. And that kind of goes back to some of the charts that Transport Canada has put together that Patrick showed earlier in the call. No matter the use of the aircraft, though, all unmanned aircraft are expected to comply with applicable regulations and any municipal, provincial, or territorial laws that may apply. Penalties do exist for the dangerous operation of aircraft and endangering the safety of other aircraft, and that's the same whether you're a UAV operator or a manned aircraft operator. And it's important to note Transport Canada has already levied some fines for illegal drones flying, and those fines at this point can go up to $25,000. Hobbyists, some of the general guidelines that was previously mentioned, they are supposed to be flown in visual line of sight only, with no first-person view devices, really the thinking there being to keep eyes on the aircraft and being able to have a good scan of the surrounding airspace around the aircraft, and to not lose as much peripheral vision as may exist with some FPV devices. To avoid moving vehicles and emergency personnel, to stay under 300 feet above ground, and to stay outside the areas within 5 miles of an airport. What are some of the approval options for commercial UAS operations in Canada? Interestingly, back in December, Transport Canada issued 2 blanket exemptions and a formal review process. The first exemption covered aircraft not exceeding 2 kilograms in weight, and the second for aircraft up to 25 kilograms in weight. Both of them, regardless of the size, require that the aircraft be operated, again, visual line of sight, at least 5 miles from an airport, below 300 feet, only in Class G airspace, and to stay at least 100 feet away from any building, structure, vehicle, person not involved with the operation. Both also require operators to remain at least 5 miles away from any built-up area, which was kind of vague when it first was released, but then Transport Canada back in January then sort of clarified that by basically saying a built-up area is any area with groups of buildings or dwellings. So anything from a small hamlet to a major city would be considered a built-up area by that definition. The second exemption does build off the first in terms of the aircraft above 2 kilograms but under 25, but it does require the operator to provide more detailed information and has more requirements on such things as pre-flight planning and the maintenance that would be applicable. It's important to note that these exemptions that can allow any UAV operator to fly legally in Canada are only available to Canadian citizens. So foreigners and those Canadian operators that can't comply with the list that Patrick had up earlier are required to obtain a Special Flight Operations Certificate, or an SFOC, which is also something that's quite common for things like air shows and that type of stuff in Canada, if you're not too familiar with that process. What are SFOCs as they respect to UAVs? They provide a UAV specific permission for a UAV to operate for typically a specific purpose at a specific location or list of locations, but they can allow for some blanket use as well. Transport Canada has done kind of a crawl, walk, run approach to this, where the first time an operator may ask for an SFOC, it will be for a kind of a limited use, limited area type operation. But as their data develops, as the operations continue, they may be able to expand the use and locations of the aircraft and where they're operating, how they're using them, based on the success of previous flights. Part of the process does require a formal application to be made to Transport Canada, and TC will vet them to basically make sure that the use of the unmanned aircraft under the SFOC will provide for an equivalent level of safety as would a manned aircraft doing the same type of operation. The application process does require a fair amount of info on the UAV's airworthiness, the personnel qualifications, and the operator itself. They'll look at the aircraft, its design, its construction, the operational procedures, the pilots, who they are, and that they've passed some kind of ground school as well to move forward with that. So they are doing a pretty good job of vetting those operators that are seeking the SFOCs. They've looked at quite a number of them at this point. More than 1,500 have been granted by Transport Canada since 2010, and it's been gaining steam. 155 were issued for commercial drones in 2011, and that's expected to be well over 1,000 this year. In fact, it may already be close to that number. Education and awareness. Why some of the concerns held with respect to UAVs are, I think, valid. There's a real need for education in this space, and Transport Canada, the FAA, other organizations around the world are doing what they can to allow these aircraft to manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft to share the skies. One thing from a certified pilot standpoint, I think we're used to aviation regulations, and we understand they serve a very critical safety function both for us, our passengers, and the people on the ground. Regulations and manned aviation allow for that predictability. We have a general idea of what an airplane that may be approaching the same airport is going to do, how they're going to communicate with the airport, where they're going to fly, what turn they may be taking next. If we're approaching another aircraft, we have kind of a common set of regulations to avoid mid-air collisions, and we have that expectation and that predictability that the other pilot involved will be doing the right thing. The challenge with UAVs is that the low acquisition cost and ease of buying them opens the world of aviation to many who don't share the same type of aviation bug that many manned aircraft pilots do. This doesn't mean that many of them aren't doing everything correctly and following all the guidelines and are operating as safely as possible, because there are many that do and will make the effort to become as educated as possible and to follow best practices and to be safe. Many of them in the community are certainly, maybe even the majority at this point. That said, many of them are unaware of where, how, and when UAVs and model aircraft can be safely operated. And I think whether we're in the manned aircraft or UAV side of the equation here, we all play a little bit of a role on helping to educate other pilots, other UAV operators, to ensure safe skies for all of us. So education is critical. TC, as Patrick put up earlier, has done some really good infographic kind of stuff off of the link there that I'd encourage everybody to take a look at. They're very easy to follow and I think quite helpful both from a manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft operator perspective in terms of how these things should be used, where they should fly, and that type of thing. Mid-air collision with a UAV, could it happen? The honest answer is yes, and there's examples of it actually having had happen with military equipment, and we hear numerous stories in the news about near misses and close calls all around the world. There was one actually on the news yesterday here in Atlanta about somebody, a commercial airliner approaching Hartsfield-Jackson here and claiming they saw a UAV near them at 3,000 feet AGL. That's something that we hear about from a UAV operator's perspective. There's unfortunately some people that are doing a disservice to the good hobby that it is and the recreational safe operation that they are by doing stupid stuff like that. But the reality of it is there's some of those things out there. One thing that kind of I think of as a pilot, as an underwriter, airplanes and helicopters are designed with the possibility of bird strikes in mind. But the makeup of a bird and UAVs just aren't the same. When birds are mostly soft tissue, their bones are pretty fragile, and just like humans, they're mostly water. Airplanes are designed to have that kind of impact. But when we look at UAVs, we've got composite materials and plastic, and maybe the biggest issue on the small UAV side is really the lithium batteries. I have a small quadcopter. These are a couple pictures I took myself just to kind of give a quick example in terms of what they're made of. You can see the rotor blades are actually pretty flexible, small, light plastic material that probably wouldn't be too dangerous to a manned aircraft. But even on the small quadcopter that I have with the lithium battery, that is a very hard object, and that's maybe the one question mark I have, where that could get hit a windshield or go through a turbine or something like that in terms of what kind of damage something even as small as that might cause. So just some things to think about there. What does it mean for us? I think that's another reason to keep a sharp visual scan when we're flying. I took this picture just of this Mylar balloon because as I was walking through a store not too long ago, I thought, you know what? Those balloons that I'm sure you're all used to seeing, that many of you, like myself, have actually kind of been surprised by while coming into an airport to land or just cruising along at a couple thousand feet. For that split second, you see this out of the corner of your eye and you don't know what it is. Kind of interestingly, these Mylar balloons are almost the same size as some of these small UAVs. And I think from a relations standpoint, that's one of those items where you can understand how quickly those balloons, you didn't see them and now all of a sudden they're there. In a worst case scenario, some of the small UAV systems could be kind of in the same situation. The difference being that the balloon's going to keep going with the direction of the wind, but a small UAV would have a controller potentially unpredictably moving that aircraft as you're flying through the sky. So again, that's not the good operator, that's not the safe operator of the UAV, but it is something that from a reality standpoint, I just think kind of provides a little bit of space to kind of understand how the size and scope of these things may pop into your visual scan out of nowhere potentially. Rules and guidelines are in place, but a lot really does depend on the UAV operator and his or her practices. As I said, many of these guys are doing everything right, and they want to be the safest, best operator they can be and are very knowledgeable and very safe. The concern for all of us, whether we're very into recreational use of UAVs or flying manned aircraft, is such that the concern for all of us is the guys that maybe don't know what they're doing or don't care. So adherence to regulations is important to manned aircraft, and getting the word out as to what they are is a good thing for us to be thinking about. So some underwriting considerations. What are insurance underwriters looking at with respect to UAVs? Like myself, it really doesn't differ a whole lot from what we're looking at when we review you. When maybe if you're an aircraft owner yourself, what we're looking at really kind of stems from 4 basic points of risk analysis when we're looking at traditional aircraft. The operator experience, who you are as a pilot or the UAV operator, how long you've been flying, the type of experience you have, that plays a very critical role in the overall attractiveness of your risk. The capabilities that you have, the types of coverages that may or may not be available, and the premiums you may pay. The make and model of the aircraft you're flying, again, whether it's a manned aircraft or a UAV, not all aircraft are the same. Not all aircraft have the same loss histories. So that's stuff the underwriters are looking at. How you're using the aircraft. Is it a commercial operation? Is it a pleasure operation? Are you flying in and out of harder to access areas, more difficult airports? Those types of things. And where you're flying, that plays a big role in the exposure as well. Now, there's a lot of questions that sort of stem from that the underwriters at different companies will ask, but there is a lot of commonality there between UAVs and manned aircraft. I thought it would be good to share with you. We're also looking from a UAV standpoint, as we do with manned aircraft, the value of the aircraft, the value of the payload, whether that be cameras or other special equipment that could be carried on manned or unmanned systems, what kind of ground equipment and how expensive that may be when we're looking at UAVs as well. But to further analyze the operation of a UAV, we also would like to see and look for some operational procedures and risk mitigation habits and practices that the UAV operator has in mind, so to reduce or eliminate some of the concerns we would have either as pilots or aviation underwriters. And then an important piece is training. Small UAV operators, there is still a need to understand the control of the aircraft, have familiarity with the components of the system, and be able to verify the safety and functionality of the aircraft, in addition to having some flight experience as well. So depending on the system, that could come into play as well. So some conclusions. The future is here right now. What can we really anticipate? There's really no way for Transport Canada, the FAA, or anyone else to know for certain how many of these things we'll actually see. The best estimates at this point, we see numbers in the tens and hundreds of thousands, but I think the reality of it is it may well be into the millions with as easy to fly and obtain these aircraft are. With there being a potential benefit, as I mentioned earlier, to nearly all industries, the number of UAV operators could be very big in 3, 5, or 10 plus years. And by very big, again, millions of operators, thousands and thousands of companies that use these. And then when we look at public entity operations, local police departments, local fire departments, things like that, you could be looking at thousands more. Unprecedented exposures, UAVs and new technology require a little bit of new thought. Shaping the coverage from an insurance perspective and a regulatory standpoint, as Patrick mentioned earlier, is kind of a big deal. New technology, new operating environment, aircraft flying at lower altitudes, new aircraft, things we've never seen before that were only the development of them only began maybe months or a year or two ago, rather than what we're used to in manned aviation, where the development of aircraft takes years through the certification process. All of this equals a new challenge from an operational standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, and from a legal and insurance perspective. The most important takeaway from that, though, is that as a pilot, as an operator of a UAV, we're all actually part of the framework that plays a role in the development of this. So being involved and being aware of this plays a big deal in moving forward. The final message for now, UAVs are here to stay. They're not going away. I think they'll become more common for general society moving forward. It's here for good. Again, the potential applications are almost limitless. Changes to regulations that are out there today, and new regulations, I think, are almost a certainty as the industry develops. It is true that unapproved operations are extensive at this point. There are people flying these all over the world in manners where they shouldn't, or in ways that they probably shouldn't. But that doesn't take away from the point that many of the operators are doing the right stuff. But an important piece to remember as well is the pace of change and new developments in this industry is far faster than we're used to in traditional manned aviation. It's much more in line with technology and software development. And one thing I heard on that was, this is kind of the first time technology can hurt somebody from a physical standpoint, a bodily injury or property damage standpoint. Many of the developers of UAVs and RC aircraft really aren't from the aviation standpoint. They're coming from a technology, software, and computer kind of backgrounds. And that develops a lot faster than aviation does. And it's something that we'll have to get comfortable with and get used to over time. So there's a lot more to come. And with that, I kind of conclude the formalities of the presentation. I hope that was of some use. And perhaps we can take some questions. I'm going to look at some that came in over the last few minutes real quick.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, if you would like to submit a question via the web, you may submit your question by placing your cursor over the green bar at the top of your screen. Click the question mark icon, type your question or comment in the space provided, then press send. Otherwise, you can press star, then 0 on your touch-tone phone. You will hear a tone indicating you have been placed in queue. If you're using a speakerphone, please pick up the handset before pressing the numbers. You may remove yourself from queue at any time by pressing the pound key. Once again, if you have a question over the phone, please press star, then 0.
One of the online questions, kind of before we take any over the phone, really relates to airspace and how much airspace does a landowner have. That's a question I think a lot of people are really looking to have the answer for. I can't speak too directly to TC's position on it, but one of the issues from the FAA's perspective, and I think applicable to a lot of what Transport Canada would be looking at, is kind of traditionally from a manned aviation perspective, we've always looked at below 400, 500 feet, where manned aircraft typically don't ever go unless they're landing or taking off out of an airport or a helicopter performing some type of function, or an ag aircraft. Really, you kind of had that nice private area that certainly below the tree line was sort of yours. The FAA's kind of looked at it differently from the standpoint, well, the airspace actually can go down to the ground, and if these aircraft are capable of operating safely low to the ground, the airspace may may be public from the standpoint of that. It's something that we'll have to develop, and questions will need to be answered there. So we'll just have to kind of follow that and see how it goes. As far as ADSB, I saw another question on that. I think that's important to think about. Right now, a lot of the systems don't have any kind of capability for that, but there are definitely proponents in the industry and people looking into the ability to have at least ADSB obviously out information and even potentially in information coming to the operator or going from the aircraft and coming into the operator, so to help mitigate some collision type of exposures that may exist. A challenge that the industry does have, though, is additional equipment increases weight. Increased weight affects the need for power and battery size and aircraft size. So it's a matter of that technology developing a little bit, but it is something people are looking forward to.
There are no questions over the phone lines.
Okay.
There's a few coming in. It'll be just a moment.
I see another question that, again, I apologize for not having the Transport Canada answer this, but the FAA is wanting to have these aircraft registered moving forward for the commercial operations. And certainly from an insurance standpoint, we do want to have some kind of specific ID number. In many cases at this point, the industry is looking at least a serial number for the different components of the aircraft, so that in the event of an accident or an incident, there is a way to not only verify coverage, but also ownership of the system.
We do have a question over the phone line from Calvin Reese. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hey, I was just wondering if it's possible to get a copy of the presentation.
We're going to try to get that put together for you. I think maybe Patrick can jump in, but we're going to look to see if we can get something out via email or post it to COPA's website in the not-too-distant future.
That'd be perfect. Thank you.
And once again, if you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press star then 0. Or if an operator has collected your name, please press star then
1. Another question related to general insurance. Really, this is being handled very similarly to how you would place manned aircraft coverage. If you do have a UAV that you'd like to have considered for an insurance policy, certainly you can work with your aviation broker. Magnus would be sure to help you, and they would be in a position to take your information and contact underwriters like myself and other carriers that are in the market to take a look at the business and move forward from there. If there's any other questions on the phone, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I think we can conclude.
We do have a few questions over the phone, sorry. We have one from Phil Lightstone. Please go ahead.
I have personally witnessed a model aircraft enthusiast take off from a park, penetrate Buttonville airspace, have absolutely disregard for Transport Canada regulations, was a student pilot, subsequently aware. So I'm kind of curious, as you pointed out, that software technology is heating up. From a airport surveillance perspective, to provide aircraft in the circuit with immediate notification of penetration of airspace by the controllers, to rather avoid being hit than talking about it after. I'm just curious where the correlation is between these two industries, looking at it from a manned pilot perspective rather than a UAV perspective.
So if I understand the question in terms of, kind of harmonizing maybe the operations of UAVs near airports without, increasing or creating a higher exposure or risk to the aircraft that are in the circuit?
It's more than a harmonization, it's a surveillance.
And so that the airport itself would be able to advise manned aircraft that would be flying nearby that there are UAVs nearby?
Correct.
Okay. There actually can be a process too, and I do think that Transport Canada, the FAA, are not ruling out entirely these aircraft operating near airports or even at airports in some cases, but it would require some very valid scrutiny over the operator, how they're flying, what they're using it for, the safety protocols and capabilities of the aircraft, so that the controlling facility or the airport itself would be able to make manned aircraft operators aware of the activity. In terms of the technology to be able to just identify, hey, one of these has sort of breached the airspace without permission, I wouldn't doubt there are people that are working on that, and certainly the capabilities for the UAV aircraft themselves to be equipped with geofencing technology that would prohibit their operation inside those areas is either in play or being worked on. The challenge I think a lot of people have from a control tower perspective is that, as we saw not too long ago when one of these things crashed on the White House lawn here in the U.S., that radar is not sophisticated enough to catch some of these things because they're so small, or they're flying too low to really be able to be picked up outside of ground clutter that a controller might see. And because they are so small visually, they might be difficult to identify until it's very close to either the aircraft or the controlling facility. So I think there's a lot to be looked at from a technological development standpoint to kind of address exactly what I think your concern is there. But I feel pretty confident based on some of the products and developments I'm seeing that there are people that have kind of that concern and awareness on the UAV product development side, thinking about that with the best interest of the flying public and manned aircraft in mind.
And if I might add, super awesome presentation, Carson.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Ron Garnett. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm calling from Canada, and it's more a suggestion than a question. In Canada, to acquire a firearm, it's necessary to get a PAL, which is a possession and acquisition license. In order to get that, it's necessary to go through a firearms safety course and background checks by the RCMP. And I'm just wondering if maybe something like that for drones might be an idea, so that there's just to be able to buy one, you have to go through some safety training and background checks, just to put some sort of a control on who owns these and who flies these.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Patrick, maybe that's something COPA and Transport Canada have thought about or could consider?
Do you hear me, Carson? Yeah. Okay, good. I didn't know if the speaker was working. Good. Well, regarding UAVs for recreational purposes, it is similar to a model aircraft, and we strongly recommend that recreational UAV operators do become member of the Model Aircraft Association of Canada. Reason being is they do carry model recreational aircraft insurance, and they do provide good courses and good consultation on how to use your UAV in a proper way. Now, UAVs for non-recreational purposes will be they will be registered, and they will have registration letters, they will have their identification plate, they will be followed closely. Education is the best way, the best venue currently, and what would be a good suggestion, yours is a very valid suggestion, and they will be registered to UAVs, non-recreational, but for the recreational part, maybe another suggestion would be to have labels, because currently you could buy a quadcopter from anywhere around the world, and some countries will ship them from wherever. The best maybe suggestion I would look at would be to have labels on these UAV kits that are shipped out throughout the country, throughout the world to Canada, where there would be a warning on or caveat to follow a course online or to go to Transport Canada's website and continue on that way for the recreational user of UAVs. Does that make sense?
Yes, and actually, I was more concerned with the background check aspect of the PAL, which is my suggestion, because the potential for terrorism and just mischief is horrendous. There's far more potential for danger or harm to individuals than a .22 rifle to go shooting squirrels with. And so, if it was necessary to go through some kind of a background check and get an actual license to acquire and possess a drone, would tend to, I think, maybe weed out the nutcases, and of course there are some out there.
Well, that's a very good suggestion. Currently, you mustn't forget that the Model Aircraft Association of Canada the modelers have been flying for years, and they do not seem to have any issue with their modelers, but it is something to take into consideration for sure. Thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
And the final question comes from Ray Hackle. Please go ahead.
It's not really a question. I reiterate a couple of comments that have been made about this excellent presentation and the value of education. And this is a very great big step in educating me as an individual, but also the general public. Here, I'm from Newfoundland, Labrador. General public here seem to be totally unaware that there are UAVs in operation out here now. So I'm not sure how we can get the general public to be aware of it. And if you were an EAA member or a COPA member, there's a limited audience that we can affect. But I think the general public, as Carson has indicated, we could have millions of users in a few years' time. So it's a big concern. How do we get the message out to the general public? And again, great presentation.
Well, thank you, Ray, on behalf of Carson and myself. There again, that is one of my concerns, and I'm relatively new to the UAV file at Transport Canada, but one suggestion I'm going to be probably bring forward in the next meeting would be to have some kind of labeling where any UAVs being shipped to Canada, they would have to have a Canadian label that would be affixed to the hobbyist box to follow either an online course, which could be possible to educate people prior to using this UAV. So
I think, but if it's just a recommendation, I don't see too many saying, "Oh, the hell with the recommendation," I'll do my thing. That's happening now, and that's where the big danger is. As Carson alluded to, the people who just don't care, don't want to care.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's something to consider in the short term.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
There's one more coming in. If an operator has collected your name, please press star then 1. And the final question comes from Tom Coniff. Please go ahead.
Yes, question. Actually, I'm a pilot up here in central BC or British Columbia, and I was flying last Sunday down at Vanderhoof Airport, and actually there were some modelers out there, remote control type aircraft pilots that were flying their little models right at the end of runway 25. I'm assuming they must have been given permission from somebody to do that. I was flying out of that runway. And,
I would hope so.
So I was kind of concerned about it, but, I've talked to a lot of people that are involved with UAVs, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there. Some people believe they could fly them anywhere. Some, just a spectrum of different opinions of where they think they could take those small aircraft. I'm actually enthusiastic about them myself, but I'm quite worried that one of these days I'm going to find one coming at me while I'm flying, in some location. But I understand that they have to talk to Transport Canada and Transport, or somebody would probably give me some information. But for example, at Vanderhoof Airport and the Fort St. James Airport, where I keep my airplane, both are uncontrolled airports. And I just the other day I was listening to somebody tell me that they're going to build a little airstrip for some more remote control planes just near the Fort St. James Airport. So I don't know. I think it's all over the spectrum right now, and sooner or later somebody's probably going to get hit by one of them, but I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to be an alarmist or anything, and I'm not going to quit flying, but there is a concern.
I think you bring up certainly valid points, and I think that the questions and the need for the education, it extends beyond just the pilots and the UAS or UAV operators themselves, but it could extend to airport managers and cities and governments that run and operate the airports to know what they should be doing, how they should be doing. I don't know that the information is that well understood even by some in that group. And I'm not talking specific to in one individual airport, but the fact that you may have these things flying around an airport in very close proximity and maybe the airport not being aware, that's something that probably is part of that education standpoint to make sure that they are the airport operators are understanding of it, and that in a case like that, it may be very safe to operate a UAV at an airport as long as the coordination's done the right way. In fact, we've seen some and looked at some that have done aerial surveys or overflights of an airport with the permission of the local tower and the air traffic control, with in the U.S. a NOTAM having been filed so that people are aware that it's there, with a very limited window when the aircraft was flying, and it can be done well that way. But certainly if the aircraft are staying low and they're staying off to a certain side of the airport or a certain distance from the center line of the runway, they probably can be operated safely. It's just a matter of coordinating it the right way and making the UAV operators and the pilots who may be flying their manned aircraft in and out of that facility, getting them on the same page.
I agree, yes. In this case, I think both airports are probably looked after by the municipalities, but when I do open flight plans, I do ask for NOTAMs and other information regarding anything I should know about what's happening.
Great.
But yes, there is some concern, though. I think maybe the municipalities should have more information. I don't know where it should go, but there can be a future incident that could be quite lethal, I think, to pilots or others who are, flying out of airports or other locations. Generally speaking, though, I don't feel threatened, but I think it is a concern that individuals who are responsible for airports or other places should know about it.
I totally agree, and I think I share your sort of cautious enthusiasm, if we want to put it that way.
Exactly. It's a great new world of aviation, but it's also kind of have to think about it a bit before I get too complacent with it. Anyway, I appreciate your time. Excellent presentation.
Thank you very much for listening and participating.
Thank you.
No other questions? That does conclude our conference for today. Thank you for your participation, for using